Our next speaker is Marica Frangakis. Marica is an independent researcher and member of the board of the Nicos Poulantzas Institute in Athens. And she is also a member of the steering committee of the EuroMemo Group, the European Economists for an Alternative Economic Policy in Europe. So Marica, please, the floor is yours.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me to this discussion on a very topical issue and a very topical matter. From a European perspective, inflation is indeed back after a long absence. An inflation narrative is needed in order not only to understand current developments, but also to provide a framework within which the left may best formulate its strategy. I shall address, having been invited to this interesting discussion, I shall address the issue of inflation, causes, consequences, political implications, mainly with reference to the EU and to the Eurozone. Roughly, what I shall do is to look into the inflation figures in the EU and the factors behind them, the role of expectations in shaping the dominant inflation narrative. I shall then examine the main elements of the EU labour market and the likelihood of a wage price spiral taking over, aka 1970s, the response of the central banks, and not just in Europe, and just a few thoughts about an alternative response from a left point of view. Okay, starting with the inflation rate in the EU. I'm sorry I haven't got any beautiful graphs, but roughly in March this year, the annual rate reached 7.8% in the European Union and 7.5% in the Eurozone. Interestingly, there is a very great variation across the member states, ranging from 4.6, which is just over half in Malta, to 15.6, which is almost double in Lithuania. And also, one should note that the big economies of the European Union present the same kind of a similar variation. So you have Germany 8%, Spain 10%, above average both, France 5%, Italy 7%, below average. What about the factors that make for inflation? The annual rate in the Eurozone, the annual rate I already mentioned, has reached 7.5%, and it was at this level both in March and in April. Now, if we exclude energy, this drops to 4.2, I'm sorry. And if we exclude energy and unprocessed food from the index, this falls to 3.9, which is almost half. In other words, inflation is to a considerable extent due to the increase in energy prices, both directly and indirectly, as well as to the increase in the price of food commodities. A significant jump is observed in the annual rate of inflation, is observed in the European Union. At the same time, there are tentative signs of a slowdown as of last April. At this point in time, we need a longer term series in order to confirm the duration, whether this inflation is going to persist. What is important, though, to note is that A, as I've just said, it shows great variation across the 27 member states. It is not yet on a steady path, and it is largely accounted for by the increase in energy prices and food commodities. Now, is inflation demand-driven or cost-driven? That's an important question. The European economy, and indeed the global economy, have suffered a double blow in recent years. Previous speakers already mentioned the pandemic, which is unfortunately still unfolding, and of course the war in Ukraine, which is equally unfortunately still carrying on. To this cocktail, one should add the zero COVID stance of the Chinese government, which further intensifies the problems created by the other two factors. So basically what we have had is lockdowns and restrictive measures during the pandemic, which led to the closing down of many businesses, especially medium and small sized, supply chain disruptions, disturbances of global trade patterns, the return to various forms of protectionism. Now, the reopening of the economy revealed many of these problems as well as intensified them. As the economy recovered, the price of energy, which had collapsed following the onset of the pandemic, for example, in May 2020, the ECB harmonized index for consumer prices for energy declined by 12%. Now, energy prices returned to a steep upward path as of mid-2021, accounting for about half, as we just said, half of the rate of inflation in the EU. The war in Ukraine led to a further soaring in energy prices, adding uncertainty about the future. And I take Chodru's point about speculative finance here, which is making matters a lot more difficult. Equally, the sanctions applied, I agree with previous speakers, the sanctions applied in order to deter and punish Russia have a damaging effect for those applying them, as Russia and Ukraine produce large amounts of global supply of gas, oil, wheat, fertilizers, etc. Overall, price pressures reflect both supply and demand factors. However, the inflation narrative carries important policy implications. Should policy, in other words, seek to dampen demand or reduce costs? Where should the emphasis lie? And I should point out at this point here that what's happening with demand in Europe is not what's happening with demand in the US. In Europe, there have been no transfers of amounts of money to the directly to the population. There have been other measures to contain the effect of the pandemic. So our analysis, to my mind, so far, points to a cost-push type of inflation, whereby energy and commodities are exerting upward pressure on costs and thereby on prices. By contrast, nominal wages are increasing at a lower rate than inflation, thus declining in real terms. At the same time, what we are witnessing is a gathering storm of stagflation. The combination of the pandemic and the war is opening the way to stagflation, as prices are rising due largely to supply factors, while growth is slowing down. I shan't go into the figures because I don't think I have the time. However, the IMF is already bringing down its general projections for growth and raising its general projections for inflation. So stagflation seems to be in the horizon. At this point, it's interesting to note the so-called unmooring of expectations. In other words, by historical standards, the current rate of inflation may be considered as moderate. For those of us who were around in the 1970s, well, this is not really impressive. This is interesting and it's worth discussing, but it's not, the end of the world. So what is all the fuss about, one might ask? Well, it is the fear that expectations will become unmoored, in quotes, or de-anchored, leading to a wage price spiral. Therefore, the emphasis shifts on worker demands for wages that compensate for the rise in prices. Indeed, the BIS general manager has warned that rising pressure on prices is likely to keep inflation at its highest level for more than 3 decades in many countries. Given the crucial role of the so-called expectations, how are they defined or measured? Well, mainly by service of experts. For example, the ECB runs a quarterly survey of the opinions and expectations of experts affiliated with financial and non-financial institutions based within the EU on inflation, growth, and unemployment. Such surveys are also conducted by news organizations such as Reuters. So we have people who are linked to mainly to the financial world, making the formulating ideas about expectations. And basically what that does is to lay the basis for the formulation of perceptions, to the extent that these expectations are all over the financial press, financial sites, and so on and so forth. So there's a climate, if you like, being cultivated here. Interestingly, a very recent BIS bulletin is headed, "Are major advanced economies on the verge of a wage price spiral?" They're not very much convinced. And actually they do say, evidence for a broad acceleration in wage growth is mixed. Wage growth has picked up significantly in the US, but remains moderate in most other advanced economies. despite tentative signs of a renewed sensitivity of wages to inflation in some segments of the labor market and a pickup in inflation expectations. If inflation remains high, households may ask for higher wages to make up for lost purchasing power, and firms may raise prices to protect profit margins. And stubbornly high inflation may lead to institutional changes, such as automatic indexation and cost of living adjustment clauses. We can see here this probabilistic kind of approach already laying the ground for expectations being unmoored, for perceptions being formulated. So the BIS report recommends that policymakers should be attuned to shifts in inflation expectations and to potential pressure to reinstate institutional structures that made economies more prone to wage price spirals in the past. That is the scare, basically, the way I read it. Now, to put these conclusions and recommendations into perspective, a quick look at the labor market in the EU. The wage share over the 20-year period 2001 to 2021 increased by less than 1%, 0.7%. It is in 2021, it was equal to 37.8%, and in the following year, it came down. Now, employers' contributions during that time, during the 20-year period, declined by 0.4%. So basically, we have had the share of labor in production increased by a very small amount. And at the same time, it has had to take responsibility for many of the benefits that employers used to contribute to in the past. This does not indicate, what we have here is a fairly static picture of the way wages are going, which was already pointed out by previous speakers. Now, the fears that a wage price spiral may be imminent tend to ignore the practically static wages in the EU, preferring to stress the fall in unemployment and the rise in job vacancies. Indeed, unemployment has declined from 7.5% of the EU labor force to 6.2% in March 2022, from nearly 16 million to 13 million. Now, I don't wish to underestimate the drop in the number of unemployed persons. However, what we have in Europe right now in the European Union is an army of unemployed that is bigger than the population of a small EU country such as Greece. And that, to my mind, does not indicate a tight labor market. It is a serious cause for concern. Other causes for concern include the very high rate of unemployment amongst the young people, which is double the rate of the average rate for the whole labor force. And of course, the divergences amongst the EU member states, which go up to 13%. The average goes up to 13% in Greece and in Spain, while the the rate for the young, the unemployed under 25s, goes up to 27 and 30%. So looking at unemployment rates on just the basis of one average rate is just, not enough. It's not. It doesn't convey the picture of what's happening on the ground. EU job vacancy rates increased, indeed, from 1.8% in 2020, at the end of 2020, to 2.8% the same quarter 2021. Again, however, differences across the EU member states are very wide, ranging from 4 in Belgium and Czechia, which is the high end, to 1 or under, or to less than 1 in Bulgaria, Greece, and Spain. In view of the above state of the labor market, I would argue that the bargaining power of the unions is anything but evident, and therefore the fear that such bargaining power will increase wages. In fact, the union's bargaining power has declined alongside their falling and graying membership, as membership has not kept pace with the rise in numbers employed, while the average age of union members is greater than the average age of wage and salary earners. As it might be expected, the proportion of employees covered by collective bargaining varies greatly. It is the highest in the Nordic countries and the lowest in the Central and Eastern European countries. Where the union membership is low, company level bargaining is dominant. Overall, it would appear that fears of an imminent wage price spiral are exaggerated. Not only is the labor market not tight across the EU, but also the unions tend to prioritize job security over higher wages, as shown by the low nominal wage increase in 2021. Now,
Please
central banks to the task. Am I over the?
Yes, close. Please wrap up as soon as
I'll try. Yeah, thanks. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Now, the central banks have rallied to the task, raising interest rates. The ECB has fallen behind and is being reprimanded for doing so, because they believe that by raising interest rates, they will hold back demand. It is and therefore discourage any wage price spiral from taking effect. Now, as we've already seen, a stagflation is somewhere in the horizon. Therefore, somebody called it monetary policy is a blunt tool. Indeed, monetary policy is a blunt tool. It risks making everything worse right now. So, one more point. What do I do? What should we do about inflation? What could be an alternative answer? Well, I don't have the actual alternative answer as such. However, I would like to give one idea, and this is price controls. It may be controversial right now. It's not new. It was very much discussed in the post-World War II period, and it has been suggested by Isabella Weber from Amherst University, and it was a strong proponent was John Kenneth Galbraith back in the 70s, actually. John Kenneth Galbraith has a very nice quote, which I would like to end with, which says that all price and wage controls involve an arbitrary exercise of public power. But this is not an objection, for it replaces an arbitrary exercise of private power, and one that has further and exceedingly arbitrary effects for those that suffer from the resulting inflation. Thank you very much. Sorry if I went over the time a lot.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and want to like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.